I am Pervez Ghauri. I am Professor of International Business and Strategy at the University of Birmingham for the last 5 years. Before that, I was in King's College London for many, many years. We have been doing lots of research for several years. Sholan, Professor Fu, and I, we earlier did a project that was funded by the European Commission, where we tried to see the role of multinationals on poverty alleviations in the emerging markets, and we study India, Brazil, Ghana, and other countries. And then for the last 2 years, we have been doing this project, ID model, where we try to see how can we develop an inclusive digital development model for marginalized communities to bring them into mainstream economic life in emerging countries. So I am going to chair this session. I will introduce the speakers first. This is a very good session because we try to see what is happening today. So we want to see the perspective of the institutions. So we have UNCTAD with us, and then we will see the World Bank groups, what they are doing today. And Sholan will present our project and see what universities are doing. So the institutional and academic point of view of what's happening in the world. First, we will have Torbjörn Fredriksson, who is Chief of ICT Policy at UNCTAD. He leads all the work on ICT, e-commerce, digital economy at UNCTAD, and they prepare annual reports such as the digital economy report and e-trade for all and the e-commerce report. So after that, we will have Sholan Fu to talk about the university side and the research going on in the universities and present a real example that we are doing. And then we will have Marcio Cruz, who is senior economist in the World Bank for Firm Entrepreneurs and Innovation Unit, where he is earlier he was working on the development economics in monitoring report, and he is a professor. So he was earlier also at the University of Parana. At the same time, he was Secretary of Planning for the state of Parana. So I would first like Torbjörn Fredriksson to please present, and we can see then after that we move to Sholan and then to Marcia. Okay, Professor Torbjörn.
Well, not quite professor yet, but I'm working on it. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having invited me again to such an exciting conference in Oxford. I wish I could be with you in real life, but I have to address this from France, close to the border of Geneva in Switzerland, where we're all suffering a lot from curfews and other mitigation measures due to the COVID pandemic. And I still look forward very much to participate in this virtual way. I think it shows the value of digital solutions, that we can still continue the dialogue and thinking process. What I would do is I will share my screen with you so that you can see what I show. And I hope that you can now see the presentation. What I will do in my presentation is to share some findings from a survey we did last year in UNCTAD on the impact of COVID-19 on e-commerce in 23 developing countries, and especially focusing on the smaller businesses that are either doing e-commerce themselves or that are providing a third-party market platform for e-commerce in these regions. I just thought it would be good to start with a bit of a global perspective before I dive into the survey results. And what we have seen, of course, during the past year is a strong surge in e-commerce around the world. And this is just one example where we can see that between 2019 and 2020, the share of e-commerce in global retail sales jumped from 14% to 17%, which is quite significant increase in just 1 year. Of course, it was interesting here to listen to the senior vice president of Tencent, which is one of the top 7 digital platforms of the world. And what we saw also now that when people and businesses and governments and other organizations went digital in full swing last year, there were a few major providers of the solutions to these kind of digital ways of continued business. And these 7 top platforms, as you know, are now among the world's top 10 companies. And if you look at the performance in the stock market for these companies from the beginning of last year to this chart ends at the end of November last year, you saw that Amazon had its stock value increasing by almost 70% in 11 months. And Tencent, for example, went up by almost 50%. So I think this is important to keep in mind as we talk about inclusiveness as well. We have a lot of people suffering, but we also have some strong winners by the pandemic in terms of the resulting outcome in the stock market. Another aspect of the inclusion here, we need to keep in mind that while in the UK about 3/4 of the population are actively buying goods and services online, we have in China almost 50% of the population buying online. But when we talk about least developed countries, most countries in Africa and so on, we're talking much lower shares, like maybe 5 or even 3% of the population. So we just need to keep this in mind when we talk about the application of digital solutions around the world. So why did we do another survey? Well, as our Secretary General here is saying, the pandemic has really accelerated the shift towards a more digital world. And we need to understand the implications of that so that we can then adopt the right policies to make sure that we have an inclusive and sustainable outcome as we move forward into the digital environment. And we are always stressing that when we go from analog to digital, it's really disrupting things. And this is creating both great opportunities for emerging countries to take advantage of the digital solutions, but it also creates a lot of risks. And we are concerned that the rapid pace at which digitalization is taking place risks leaving a lot of people behind. And while we're talking that no one should be left behind, we also need to think about no one should be left offline as we move forward. Our survey focused on 23 countries. And these are countries where we have our own technical assistance activities in some form. We had 257 respondents from e-commerce businesses and third-party market platforms. And we also had a number of 12 responses from policymakers in these countries that share their experience with adapting to the crisis. As you can see, more than half of the businesses have less than 10 employees. So we're really targeting micro and small businesses first and foremost. 40% almost of the respondents were female, and the period was between March and July last year. So what kind of observations can we see? So there was a clear difference between the third-party online marketplaces that are providing e-commerce opportunities for any company, and the other companies that were selling at least some of their products online. And where the market platforms saw their e-commerce sales increase almost across the board, 2/3 of them saw the very strong increase. Among the normal e-commerce companies, for more than half of them, they actually saw their e-commerce sales decrease, partly because, of course, people were reducing their expenditures, and they were also confronted with various logistical challenges as a result of the COVID pandemic. And so we see that in terms of big trends, those that are wholly digitally business models were very much more resilient to the current crisis, and they were able to expand their sales and onboarding new merchants. So they got more customers buying and more sellers selling. We also saw in these low-income countries that we really engaged in that a lot of the sales were facilitated through social media and very much driven by the mobile internet access. E-payments, they grew fast, very much across the board. You saw a growing appetite for going from cash on delivery to digital and mobile payments. But of course, across these countries, cash on delivery still remains the most important way of paying for e-commerce. In terms of the types of products that were most affected, we saw especially food and beverages. We saw an increase in food deliveries. We saw a growing use of market platforms for finding pharmaceuticals, hygiene and health products. And of course, throughout both before and after, electronics and various IT equipment was very high up on the list of things people bought online in these countries. Let me see if I can just move on. Yes, some of the challenges that the companies highlighted to us in the surveys, half of the respondents complained that the government did not prioritize the e-commerce dimension enough. Many complained about the high cost of especially broadband access in these countries. And there are still severe gaps in ICT adoption and connectivity, especially when you move outside of the urban centers. And there's a low capacity to invest in e-commerce business growth. And that, of course, hampered their ability to actually address the growing demand for online purchases. There have been serious disruptions in supply chains and trade logistics that had an impact on especially goods producing companies that were selling online. And there is a tremendous problem of trust in the online world in many of these countries, partly reflecting poor consumer protection and competition policies. And as I already mentioned, there is still the persistent reliance on cash on delivery payment solutions, which even though the other opportunities have started to increase. What kind of actions would these firms like the policymakers to take? Well, in many of these countries, the number one demand was create a national e-commerce strategy so that we have a coherent and consistent approach to preparing for the e-commerce world. They are also asking the governments to increase the publicity or awareness raising efforts for e-commerce to kind of mitigate the lack of trust in online transactions. There's a strong demand for skills training, a lot of both among businesses but also among consumers, so that they can predict where the risks are and how to mitigate risks. And then there is also a demand for lowering the cost of using e-payment solutions. Now, if we look at some of the things that countries have done to deal with the crisis in this area, we got, as I said, 12 responses from low-income countries. And the ones that have been most active in this area were Rwanda, Senegal, Tunisia, Cambodia, and Togo. And the most commonly used measures here were to provide financial incentives and various liquidity support schemes to the businesses involved, and also to develop various digital solutions to provide health and education services remotely. In Tunisia, for example, they promoted quality standards to help build trust across the digital ecosystem, and they introduced what they call Label de Confiance initiative. In Senegal, there were new collaborative platforms created to onboard new businesses and support local producers. In Uganda, e-commerce platforms were tasked to promote contactless payments and logistics by nurturing new partnerships with development partners, powering recovery from the COVID-19. In Myanmar, for instance, e-commerce and the digital economy are central elements in their government's COVID-19 economic relief plan. This is something that you don't see too much of in many other countries, so we think that it's quite innovative. In terms of moving forward then, so we see this need to develop a national e-commerce strategy or a digital transformation strategy or something to that effect that can bring the various ministries together, because there is not any one single ministry that can address the challenges of digital transformation. There is a need for reducing the cost of internet access and especially broadband access. And there is a need to reduce the cost of using the non-cash based payment solutions. And there are some other suggestions. So if there is one core message that has come out from this COVID pandemic, it is really that investing in building digital readiness in the low-income countries has become even more important to ensure that they are able to take advantage of the digital solutions, just like we are doing today in terms of the interaction, but also in terms of commerce and developing the digital economy. So let me conclude here with just a few reflections on what we in UNCTAD are doing. We are providing new research and statistics, such as the one I just shared. We will be launching our digital economy report next September, and it will be all focusing on cross-border data flows and what does it all mean for development, how do we deal with that. We try to bring the stakeholders together, both from the private sector, from the government sector, and from the various international organizations. And I have told you at the previous conference about the E-Trade for All initiative that now has about 32 partners. Instead of everyone working in silos, let's come together and see how we can find the synergies and avoid duplication. We are doing these rapid E-Trade readiness assessments of the least developed countries, but also increasingly of non-LDCs, because all these countries are seeing this dramatic need for understanding where they are and what they can do to improve their ability to participate in the digital economy. We've just launched also our E-Trade for Women initiative, as we see the tremendous untapped potential for women entrepreneurs to play a much more important role in the digital economy. And we are seeing this need to engage more with the development partners, because there's still a situation where donors that have been providing assistance to developing countries for decades still are slow to really jump on the digital dimension of the development agenda. And there we hope that our work can also help to guide their work. As I said, leaving no one behind will increasingly need to mean leaving no one offline as well. So thank you very much for your attention.